Namo Sakyamuni Buddha. Dear Buddhists, today we sit here together, under the compassionate shadow of the Three Jewels, to listen to one of the fundamental truths of Buddhism, which is the noble truth of suffering. As human beings, we cannot avoid the pain, the challenges, the sufferings that this life brings. But to understand what suffering is, to know how to face and overcome suffering, we need to thoroughly understand the principle of the noble truth of suffering. In the Four Noble Truths that the Buddha taught us, the noble truth of suffering is the first truth. Suffering in Buddhism is not simply physical or mental pain. Suffering, in a deeper sense, is everything that binds us to the cycle of birth and death, making our souls unable to escape the pain of life. Suffering is the existence of dissatisfaction, of fear, and of death. The Buddha taught that birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering, not getting what you want is suffering, separation from what you love is suffering, meeting what you hate is suffering, and the 5 aggregates are suffering. What are these 8 types of suffering? They are the forms of suffering that we encounter in life, which no one can avoid. Birth is suffering. From the moment we cry out at birth, we have entered a world of suffering. From the difficulty of survival, from the struggle between life, the struggle between instinct and need, we constantly endure these pains until we leave this world. Old age is suffering. When old age comes, the body gradually weakens, the mind fades. People begin to see more clearly their limitations. What we once held, what we once valued, what we once relied on, now becomes meaningless when the decline of the body becomes inevitable. Sickness is suffering. In this body, illness is always a threat. Whether rich or poor, high or low status, people must face illness. It destroys the body, weakens the spirit, and sometimes makes us doubt and fear the fragility of human life. Death is suffering. Death is inevitable. From the moment of birth, death has been the final destination of every life. It brings with it fear, regret, and invisible suffering. Not only is it the end of a life, death is also the separation from everything we love, everything we have built. The suffering of not getting what we want. In life, everyone has wishes, but not all wishes come true. Dissatisfaction, disappointment when not achieving what we wish for is an inevitable form of mental suffering. The suffering of separation from what we love. When we have to part with someone we love, not just our spouse, but also our parents, children, or friends, we feel lonely, lost, and inconsolable pain. The suffering of resentment. On the contrary, meeting people we do not want to meet, having to live with or face people who hate us, is also a type of suffering. The suffering of the 5 aggregates of attachment. This is a type of mental suffering arising from clinging to the 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. When we identify ourselves with the body and mind, causing suffering to arise from delusion. Dear audience, suffering does not only exist in the body, but also deep in the mind of each of us. Mental suffering is the anxiety, worry, anger, and fear that we carry with us every day. The human mind is often confused by desires, delusions, and clinging to the ego. When we want things to go our way and they don't, we suffer. When we don't accept the truth of impermanence, we suffer. When we place too much expectation on others or on things outside ourselves, we suffer. Mental suffering is a form of suffering that the Buddha called mental illness, and it is much more difficult to cure than physical suffering. But the Buddha taught that there is no suffering that cannot be overcome. When we recognize and accept the truth of suffering, we have taken the first step on the path to liberation. It is not about running away from suffering, but about understanding and transforming it. That is the meaning of studying Buddhism. Not about escaping from life, but about living a life that is not enslaved by suffering. Transforming suffering is not easy, but it is not impossible either. The Buddha taught that the key to transforming suffering is mindfulness and wisdom. Mindfulness is the awareness of each present moment, the awareness and not letting the mind be carried away by delusions and worries. When we know how to stop, know how to look deeply into our own suffering, we will see its cause. And when we realize the cause, we can find a way to overcome it. Mindfulness is the clear awareness of our emotions, our body, and our mind. When we know how to sit with ourselves, look at suffering instead of running away from it, we will see that suffering is not the enemy. Suffering, in fact, is a part of life, a lesson that we need to learn to mature spiritually. Together with mindfulness, wisdom is the light that guides us through suffering. Wisdom helps us understand that everything is impermanent, nothing lasts forever, and all the suffering we experience is due to causes and conditions. When we understand this, we will no longer be bound by suffering, but instead, we will know how to let go. Dear friends, life is inherently full of suffering, but it is in suffering that we find the path to liberation. The Buddha taught that suffering is an inevitable truth, but that does not mean we have to endure it forever. With mindfulness and wisdom, we can learn to transform suffering into happiness and find peace in the midst of life's many changes. May we all understand and practice the Dharma so that we no longer have to suffer for what has passed, nor worry about what has not yet come, but live fully in the present with a peaceful mind and clear wisdom. Namo Sakyamuni Buddha. Dear Buddhists, after talking about the noble truth of suffering, we cannot help but delve deeper into mental suffering, a silent but often persistent pain deeply engraved in the human soul. Physical suffering can be easily recognized and resolved, but mental suffering is a fire burning from within, making our minds confused and tired. Many times we do not realize that mental suffering is the root of all the problems we are facing. And it is this mental suffering, if not clearly understood, that will cause us to continue to get lost in the cycle of birth and death. Where does mental suffering come from? It comes from the illusions we cling to. The desires for fame, status, love, and material things can all become traps that imprison our souls. When we cling to things that are impermanent, we are disappointed when they disappear. When we demand that things always go our way, we suffer when life does not go our way. And that is where the cycle of suffering begins. One of the greatest causes of suffering is ignorance. Ignorance is blindness, the inability to see the truth of life. When we do not realize that everything is impermanent, that everything is born and dies, we become attached to what we love and desire. We think that happiness is getting what we want, and when those things disappear, we suffer. We live with an ego that always wants to be protected, to be cherished. But it is that ego that keeps us trapped in a vicious cycle of suffering. The Buddha taught that attachment is the root of all suffering. When we cling to fame, money, relationships, or even the idea of ourselves, we create suffering for ourselves. Because nothing in this life is permanent. Everything changes. Everything is impermanent. Everything is born, exists, and dies. It is the natural process of human life. But when we fail to see this, we cling to what we think is permanent. And when things no longer go as planned, suffering arises. The ego, also known as the I, is one of the sources of mental suffering. When we identify with the ego, we create a distinction between me and other. We demand that others treat us the way our ego wants, and when they do not, we feel hurt, angry, and resentful. But we fail to realize that the ego is just an illusion. The ego we cling to is just a collection of thoughts, memories, habits, and attachments to the five aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. The Buddha taught that if we learn to let go of the ego, learn to look at life with a selfless eye, we will no longer be dominated by afflictions and suffering. When there is no ego, we will no longer distinguish between self and others, between right and wrong, between gain and loss. Our minds will become more peaceful and calm. Dear Buddhists, to face and transform suffering, we need to start by looking directly at our pain. Many times, we fear and avoid pain, but that avoidance only makes it greater. The Buddha did not teach us to avoid suffering, but rather, he taught us to face it with understanding and mindfulness. When we can face our pain calmly, we begin to see its true cause, and when we understand the cause, we can begin to resolve it. Practicing mindfulness is a powerful way to transform suffering. When we practice mindfulness, we can recognize and control our emotions. Instead of being swept away by emotions, we learn to observe them so that we are no longer controlled by them. Mindfulness helps us realize that emotions, like everything in life, are impermanent. Emotions come and go. They do not last forever. When we realize this, we will no longer cling to negative emotions, and they will naturally dissolve like clouds drifting in the sky. In addition to mindfulness, the practice of wisdom is also an important factor in transforming suffering. Wisdom here is not only understanding the world, but also the clarity in seeing the true nature of all things. When we understand that everything is dependently arisen, is closely related to each other, we will no longer see ourselves as the center of the universe. And from there, the ego will gradually disappear. Wisdom helps us see clearly that nothing is permanent. No pain lasts forever. Everything changes, and when we accept that change, we will no longer be afraid of loss and difficulties in life. Wisdom also helps us see that suffering is not an enemy. Suffering is a part of life, a lesson that we need to learn to mature and progress on the path to enlightenment. Once we understand the nature of suffering, the next important thing is to know how to let go. Letting go does not mean giving up life, giving up all responsibilities, but letting go of attachment to impermanent things. We still live in life, still work, still love, but we no longer cling to the results of our actions. We understand that everything is a matter of cause and effect, and the results are not always as desired. When we know how to let go, our mind will become light, peaceful, no longer controlled by pressure or anxiety. Letting go also means letting go of the ego, the source of all suffering. When we no longer identify ourselves with the ego, we will no longer be moved by praise or criticism, gains or losses. We will live a peaceful, serene life, no longer caught up in the vortex of greed, anger, and delusion. We will see that true happiness is not getting what we want, but knowing how to accept and be satisfied with what we have. Dear audience, peace is not something far away. It lies right in the present, in every moment, when we know how to practice mindfulness, wisdom, and letting go. Peace is not a fixed state, but a journey that we must continuously practice and train. May all of us, those who are listening to the Dharma today, be able to understand the noble truth of suffering, recognize and transform mental suffering. May we all practice mindfulness, wisdom, and letting go to live a peaceful and serene life. May the light of the Buddha Dharma shine into our hearts, leading us on the path of liberation, overcoming suffering and finding true joy in life. Namo Sakyamuni Buddha. Dear audience, we have talked about letting go and the path to peace through mindfulness and wisdom. But letting go does not mean we have to give up what we have. Letting go is truly an art of living. It is how we know how to live in the present without letting our hearts be bound by the past or the future. Peace does not come from trying to avoid difficulties, but from knowing how to live in harmony with everything that happens in this life, whether it is joy or sadness. The Buddha taught that all suffering in life comes from our own minds. If we know how to keep our mind pure, know how to face every situation with awareness, then nothing can make us suffer. Then suffering is no longer a problem, but only a part of the journey towards enlightenment. It is through suffering that we learn the most valuable lessons, and it is through suffering that we see the value of peace. But peace, as mentioned, is not a permanent state that we achieve once and for all. It is a continuous journey, a never-ending practice. Every day we need to practice mindfulness to always remind ourselves to live in the present so as not to be swept away by delusions, worries, or baseless hopes. Dear Buddhists, life is not without challenges, but what is important is how we face those challenges. The Buddha taught that a wise person is one who knows how to keep his mind calm amidst the upheavals of life, knows how to see suffering as just a part of human existence, and does not let it affect the purity of his soul. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha taught, "The wise person does not worry about what is past, does not worry about what is yet to come. He lives in the present with a calm and peaceful mind." We need to learn to live like this, knowing that everything comes and goes according to karma. Nothing in this life can last forever, including suffering or happiness. Therefore, we should not be too immersed in temporary emotions and forget their impermanent nature. Suffering, when viewed correctly, is not something to be feared. It is just a challenge for us to grow, to learn to rely on ourselves, and find peace from within. When we understand this, we will no longer be afraid of difficulties, but on the contrary, we will see suffering as an opportunity for us to train our minds, to train our awareness. Dear Buddhists, mindfulness is not just a practice during meditation, but is awareness in every moment of life. Every action, every word, every thought of ours requires mindfulness. When we eat, we know we are eating, feeling every sweet, sour, bitter taste. When we walk, we know we are walking, knowing every step is touching the ground, not letting our minds get caught up in unnecessary worries. Mindfulness helps us live fully in the present. It helps us see that every moment in life is a miracle, an opportunity to experience, to learn, and to grow. When we live mindfully, we will no longer chase after illusions, worry about the future, or regret the past. All we need to do is live fully in the present moment, with gratitude and awareness. Dear Buddhists, another important factor in transforming suffering is wisdom. But wisdom is not just theoretical understanding, but also the clarity in how we treat others. Wisdom needs to be combined with compassion, because only compassion can help us sympathize and tolerate others, and it is compassion that helps us know how to face suffering more gently. In Buddhist scriptures, compassion is one of the most important virtues that every Buddhist needs to practice. Compassion is not only love for living beings, but also understanding and accepting what is happening. When we know how to live with compassion, we will no longer resent, no longer blame others or ourselves. Compassion helps us open our hearts, helps us see clearly that all suffering has a cause and that everyone is suffering in their own way. When we have wisdom and compassion, we will know how to face difficult situations wisely and kindly. We will no longer react hastily or emotionally, but instead, we will know how to look deeply into the root of the problem, understand its causes and effects, and from there know how to handle everything in a gentle and kind way. Dear audience, attachment is one of the greatest causes of suffering. When we attach to thoughts, emotions, or feelings, we bind ourselves in a cage of delusion. The Buddha taught that everything in life is impermanent, but we often forget this. We cling to the things we love, thinking that they will last forever. But when they disappear, we feel pain, loss, and from there arise suffering. Letting go of attachment does not mean we do not care or do not love. On the contrary, letting go is a way for us to love more truly, without being bound by expectations or demands. When we love without attachment, we will know how to accept what is happening naturally and will not suffer when things change. Letting go is the path for us to find true peace in our hearts. Dear Buddhists, the truth about suffering and how to transform suffering is one of the most important teachings that the Buddha left us. Suffering is an inevitable part of life, but we can learn to overcome it with wisdom, mindfulness, and compassion. When we understand the nature of suffering, we will no longer be afraid, no longer cling, and from there find liberation for ourselves. May we all live with awareness, compassion, and wisdom, so that each passing day is a peaceful day, no longer dominated by suffering. May the light of the Buddha Dharma always illuminate our souls, guide us on the path of liberation, overcome all suffering, and find true joy in life. Namo Sakyamuni Buddha.